I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay respect to the elders both past and present of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present.
Becomes a bit intractable. And so another approach, so this would come under the heading of global matrix factorization methods, but another approach would be a local context window method such as Word2Vec, which you may have heard of. And the idea behind this is that you take a neural network with a single hidden layer, and you try and predict from any target word the words that occur around it. So in the context might be a sentence or a window of a particular size. Alternatively, you might be predicting from the context words the target word. It depends on which implementation you're using. But the core idea is once you've trained this model to predict words from words around or words around to words, when you feed in a particular word like defeats, and it's predicting, I mean, this is the actual words that occurred around it rather than its predictions, which would be like probabilities. But you can take the hidden layers activations, and that would be your vector representation for the word defeats when you feed it into the network. And the number of dimensions that you obtain from that will be determined by the number of hidden units that you chose for your network. And the advantage of this is that it learns very incrementally. And so it's been possible to train this on huge data sets of like hundreds of billions of words. So we've looked a bit at the algorithms behind vector space models, but I'd like to turn briefly to the training data, because so far we've been imagining that these models have been trained on things like the common crawl, these huge online data sets of words. But there is an alternative, and by psychological standards, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this data set, it's a very large one. It is a free association data set with 100 primary and secondary and tertiary responses to each keyword. So you would ask people a question like, what's the first word that comes to mind when you hear cat? And they might give fur. And there are, I think, in the English version, something like 12,000 keywords in this data set. And as you can see, whilst it's considerably smaller than machine learning type data sets, there are a number of reasons why it might be interesting to use free associations to derive these embeddings instead of online text data. So some of these reasons, one might be when people are providing these quick responses, it might be that perhaps you're encoding things like affect a bit better. And as we'll see later, when we're applying these representations in the context of risk perception, affect has been sort of hypothesized as quite an important, playing an important role in that with the risk as feelings hypothesis. Then it might be that there are also more direct insights into our mental representations. So if you can imagine that a lot of the text data that's online could be constrained by real world relationships. A lot of these like Wikipedia articles or news articles, it's a lot of nonfiction. And then when you ask someone to give a free associate, a lot more abstract relationships could be elicited from that. And then finally, text can be constrained by certain pragmatic communication rules. So for instance, a classic example is it would be so obvious that bananas are yellow that you don't often find the phrase yellow banana in text, whereas it would be probably more likely to occur in free associations and a better representation of how we think about bananas. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce the sort of first project that I've been working on with Dirk Wolf and Rui Mata in Basel, and that is semantic accounts of risk perception. So before we jump into what we did, why even study risk perception in the first place? About 4 decades ago, Slovak and others put forward a research agenda into the study of risk perception, and they gave a few main motivations for doing so. And whilst research has certainly progressed since then, I think that these motivations are just as relevant, if not more relevant today. So for instance, with technologies arriving at an ever increasing rate and new hazards that we're facing, being able to anticipate people's responses and communicate effectively about risks seems reasonably important. And you can also think about the sort of recent example of the pandemic and how people's perceptions of getting COVID, the risk of getting COVID, and also the risks of getting vaccinated played a really important role and were very consequential. So that's what the motivations. Now, what are we doing? We did a reanalysis of work by BHATIA in 2019. And he asked participants a simple question, which was for a load of risk sources, he would ask on a scale of -100 to 100, how risky would you rate this risk source? And there would be things like chess and dog and nuclear power. They didn't have to be risky things, but just things that would give you a nice mixture of responses. So you get a lot of variance. And then you take the means for each risk source. So you end up with as many mean risk ratings as you have risk sources. And that's the data that you're trying to predict when you're trying to predict risk perception. BHATIA then went and used 2 models to predict that data, one of which is a classic psychometric model with 9 dimensions. So this is these 9 dimensions proposed by Fishoff and others as being important to explaining risk perception. And these might be dimensions such as how much dread does this risk source evoke, or how much knowledge do we have about it? How much knowledge does science have about it? And the idea is that you will ask people for each risk source, you'll ask participants on some sort of like 7-point Likert scale, you'll ask them, how much dread does this risk source evoke? And then they'll give you a response. And for each risk source, for each dimension, you'll take the means. And you'll end up with a 9-dimensional vector representing each risk source, and that's your psychometric model. An alternative, which BHATIA was trying to test, was a text-based model, Word2Vec. In this case, the one trained on the Google News dataset, which I think had 100 billion tokens. And these are 2 models that we also use, but we, in our reanalysis, extend it. So we also add fast text, which is a more recent like sort of a modified version of Word2Vec with certain things like position-dependent weighting of the context words. There's also a version of fast text which is trained on subword information. We don't use that one. We use the full word one. And then there's Glovey, which is a bit different in architecture from Word2Vec. You can maybe think about it as like bit of a halfway between latent semantic analysis, or these global matrix factorization methods, and these local context window methods like Word2Vec. And Glovey is also trained on considerably more data as well. I think it's 840 billion tokens, which is pretty incredible. And then finally, we use a free association model trained on SWO with latent semantic analysis. So these are the models. Just to reiterate, what we're doing is we're just running a regression on each vector representation of each risk source. In this case, we have the 9 psychometric dimension representations. And you can think of the psychometric model as almost like a manual feature engineering approach, where psychologists have gone and hypothesized and tested which dimensions they believe to be important for predicting risk, and they've collected that data. And on the other hand, you can think of these semantic accounts as sort of like an automatic approach, where you've either attained them online from this text data, or in the case of free associations, from the free association data sets. So because we're running into a similar, as you can see, we have 300 latent dimensions predicting a sample of 306 mean risk ratings. So we're getting pretty close in terms of our number of features to our number of samples. And as a consequence, we decided to, we had to use regularized regression to avoid overfitting and things like this. Could I just see, could I ask how many people are familiar with regularized regression? If you could put up your hand. Okay, sorry, people on Zoom, I'm gonna assume that the distribution in this room is similar to all of you. The core idea behind regularized regression is that in ordinary least squares regression, you're just trying to minimize the squared error. In regularized regression, you're adding a term into that objective function, which penalizes more complex models. And so it's a way of ensuring that you bias your model towards simplicity in order to reduce things like overfitting and variance in the model predictions. So we specifically use elastic net regression, which is a very flexible form of like regularization in order to do that. And in order to compare our models, we use cross-validation. The core idea behind this is that you split your data into sets. So you train your model on a different set of data to the data that you tested on, in order that more complex models don't just automatically do better. It's only more complex models that learn some pattern that generalizes to the test set. And then we do tenfold cross-validation just to ensure that your results don't just depend on the particular split of data that you made. And we repeat that 10 times just to be extra sure. So getting on to the results, on the x-axis here, you can see the mean tenfold cross-validation R squareds. And on the y-axis, we have our models, including the two that BHATIA analyzed in his 2019 paper. We also have the maximum theoretical R squared that we could obtain as estimated from the reliability of the mean risk ratings. And here we have the psychometric model's performance, which is explaining around 73% of the variance. It's pretty good. The error bar is a 95% confidence interval, adjusted for the fact that there is some dependence between samples when you're doing things like cross-validation. So how might the text-based models perform against this sort of manual feature engineering approach? Pretty good, not as good. And we might expect that the other ones, though, perform a bit better, given that they're trained on more data and benefit from some architectural improvements. So as you can see, like fast text does slightly better perhaps, and Globy does, again, slightly better perhaps. And then we get on to SWO, the free association, and it's on par with the best performing text-based models, which is pretty cool because it's trained on a data set that's orders of magnitude smaller, and so it seems to be learning quite efficiently from that data. So we don't just have to compare the individual models, we can also combine models into an ensemble. And by that, I just mean you really take the vector for one model and you concatenate the vector for another model. So you have as many dimensions as the sum of the two models' dimensions. So we have the individual models here, and then we have the various combined models. And what's interesting is that, well, firstly, we're able to explain, in the best case, almost 87, 88% of the variance. And also you can see that perhaps, there's either some, if you look at psych plus Glove plus SWO, and you compare it to psych plus SWO or psych plus Glove, when you add one of the text-based models, when you add, like, for instance, SWO onto psych plus Glove, you're not really getting much extra performance. And you might ask, why is that? One reason might be that there's some redundancy between the models and there's some overlap. But another reason might just be that our training set is too small, and that we're running into issues where we have 609 dimensions predicting 306 samples. And if we were to have a larger training set, then we might be able to improve the performance of the largest ensemble model and the other models as well. So with that in mind, we decided to try and test whether we could get more performance with a larger training set. We basically took subsamples of our data and trained the models on those subsamples to see how performance changes with the number of risk sources in your training set. And it looks like we could potentially extrapolate, be getting more performance out of these models. So for instance, you can see that the psychometric model, which starts off pretty high already, seems to be sort of tapering off, given that you now already have like 195, 244 risk sources, and only 9 dimensions that you need to fit. Whereas with the other models, not only do you have more dimensions, but not all of those dimensions are necessarily going to be relevant to predicting risk perception. And so your regression is having to find the relevant dimensions as well. So with that in mind, we're planning on collecting more data with a larger set of risk sources. But before we do that, oh yeah, that's what we're hoping for. Before we do that, I'd like to think a bit about applications. So if you think about it, imagine trying to apply these vectors in the real world outside of a survey-based setting. Let's say you're trying to analyze the riskiness or the risk perception of tweets. The first thing you're going to run into is that for most of the words in those data sets, you're not going to have psychometric ratings for. You only have them for 400 and something words in Sudip Bhatia's data set. And so you would have to go and ask people a load of psychometric questionnaires, or a load of people a psychometric questionnaire. And that would be really costly, really time consuming. And you'd probably be wondering, why didn't I just ask the people how risky they perceive the tweets to be, rather than trying to predict it. So the alternative would be to use your semantic vectors, which you have a lot more representations for a lot more words for. So in the case of SWO, you have like 12,000 words. And in the case of Glover, you have like millions. So there would still be an issue though, because as we've tested these on single words, these models, with all of these predictions. And when you run into real data sets, most of them come in the form of blocks of text. So you might have some messiness in there that you have to deal with. And how do you go about predicting the risk perception of a block of text versus a single word is a question with lots of options. So we decided to try and do like sort of a proof of concept of whether this could work by going through every word that's been said in British Parliament speeches between 1805 and 2004. And it turns out that British MPs seem to love making speeches. So there were like millions of speeches to go through, which was quite fun to code, and it required a bit of optimization. And we had we tried with Glove, SWO, and just Glovey as well. And it turned out that it seemed like Glove SWO was making picking up on slightly more signal, perhaps because the data set of words that we have in SWO, and therefore the words that we have vector representations for in Glove SWO, might be more relevant to risk perception and might also just be higher quality. And as you can see, this is what it looks like, which at first sort of appears like a mess. I didn't really, when I first ran this, have any idea what happened in 19th century Britain. So I couldn't really interpret the stuff over there. But the first thing that jumped out to me was the two peaks over here, which would be World War I and World War II. And that peak in World War II actually corresponds almost to the point at the end of the Blitz. And I haven't checked this yet, but it would be interesting to zoom in a bit closer and see if you could spot like specific things that happened in World War II more clearly at a finer grain. But I forgot to mention that this line plot is the mean predicted risk perception for each year. So we had the model make the prediction for every word that it had a representation for, and then average that for each year. What could the other stuff be? A colleague mentioned to me that it might be the post-Napoleonic depression preceding the Battle of Waterloo. But you still wonder why, for instance, it's so volatile and so much more risky seeming at its peak than World War I and World War II. And I think this just points to the fact that this isn't a perfect approach. There's a lot of messiness in the data. Some of the messiness comes from the fact that, for instance, if you imagine if you're asking why since 1960 things seem to have been getting riskier, it's possible that British MPs have been speaking as if things are getting riskier. It's also possible that the fact that our training set contains a lot of modern technologies means that the model is just biased to perceiving recent conversations as more risky. So not perfect, but I think like a proof of concept that this can be applied in out of lab type situations. So what would be next in this project? We've generated a sample of around 1,000 risk sources, so that would be 700 on top of what Sudeep BHATIA already had. And we plan to run our main study very soon to collect risk ratings and psychometric ratings for these risk sources, and hopefully improve the model performance and also sort of robustness of our results. So that's predicting risk perception. I'd like to talk about one final thing, which is a project that I've recently started working on with Ben Newell and Dirk Wolf, and that is called psych embeddings. And the core rationale behind this project is when you do something like latent semantic analysis on SWO, latent semantic analysis wasn't designed as a way to optimally extract representations from pre-association data. And it might be that if we were to use some psychological theory and think a bit more about how people get from receiving a cue like cat and giving a response like fur, then we might be able to obtain higher quality representations by thinking about this process. So one idea, which was inspired by a recent paper by Rhodes and Love, was, well, I'll explain the paper first. So what Rhodes and Love did was they were trying to enrich ImageNet, which is a really large data set for visual object recognition, machine learning. And they were trying to enrich it with human similarity judgments. So they had people go through a huge number of images in that data set and select the two most similar images to a target image from an option set of 8, as you can see here. And then they used that data, those similarity ratings, to infer the underlying embeddings, people's embeddings or representations of those images. And they ultimately used that to evaluate other models, but we would like to draw inspiration from their approach for inferring those embeddings in the first place. And that had two core components. So the first was a similarity function. The idea is you receive a target image and you look at your other options, your option set, and you compare their similarities. And you compare their similarities to the target image, in this case, using Luce's ratio of strengths. And both of these things seem reasonably reasonable. In a bit more detail, you might use for instance, a Euclidean distance between your target and your option image, and then feed that into Luce's ratio of strengths in order to come up with your response. So if we were to apply this idea of how people go from receiving a target word to evaluating the similarities, then in the case of Luce's ratio of strengths, dividing the similarity of the cue to a particular target by the sum of the similarities of all of the options, and that would be your probability of selecting that target, that cue, sorry, that response. Then if we were to apply that in our setting, which I've been sort of mixing up the words for already, you would take in a cue, you would compare it to all of the potential options for responses, with some similarity function, and then you would output your response. As we'll see later, there are some issues with this idea because unlike in Rhodes and Love's approach, where you're comparing to an option set of 8 images, in the case of free associations, you have an option set of potentially all of the words that you know. We'll get onto that in a second, but a bit more formally, this is what you might be doing. So I've been saying verbally what Lucis ratio strength is, but this is the formula. And yeah, they use that in a Bayesian context. So they use that as their likelihood function in order to calculate the probability of in our case, a response given a Q, in their case, a response image given a Q image or target image. And yeah, they use variational Bayesian inference, which is a form of approximate inference, which makes it a tractable problem, given the size of these data sets and the number of parameters that you're trying to fit. But there is still an issue, which is in this denominator of the Lucis ratio strengths formula, which is in the case of SWO, you might have, depending on how you choose to pre-process your words, whether you use some form of limmatization or not, and whether you decide to get rid of certain infrequent words, you might have around 10 to the 4 or 10 to the 5 unique words that you are summing over every time you run this equation. And this is not a unique problem. So actually, if you look at Word2Vec, they run into a very similar issue where in the output layer, you have a softmax, which is basically Lucis ratio strengths. And in the denominator, you're summing over a huge number of unique possible words. And so as a solution to that, I think Mikolov proposes a negative sampling approach. And I think it might be that we also need to use some kind of negative sampling, some sort of sampling approach, and maybe negative sampling would be the most obvious option when we try and do this as well. So what exactly are we going to try and do with this project? I think the first thing, which is sort of almost done now, is implementing a version of it in TensorFlow and Keras. So these formulas, this idea of using a similarity function and Lucis ratio strengths, it has a neural network style interpretation, which can be implemented in TensorFlow. And that should also mean that we can do some GPU optimization, which should help with calculating that denominator, which would, in reality, thinking about what people are actually doing, they're not going to be doing that. They're not going to be comparing the similarity of a word to every single other word they know, probably, but it might be approximating something of what people are doing. And once we've got the models running and trained, we can start comparing different models. So we can test different similarity functions, for instance. We might use cosine similarity, Euclidean distance, maybe one or two others. And then when we test the representations obtained by these models on different cognitive tasks, so tasks like similarity judgment, memory tasks, categorization, you could feed it into like the exemplar model or something, and judgment and decision-making tasks like predicting risk perception, we can start thinking about which similarity functions people might be using when they're giving associates to Qs. And then the next step might also be taking into account the dependencies over time between previous responses given and the current responses that you're giving, because it's already been shown by Richie and others in a recent talk that they've done and previous research that there is this dependency between the response you're giving now and previous responses to Qs. And they implement that with a recurrent neural network. So I think it could be quite cool to try and maybe put this all together into one model to rule them all, but we'll see how complicated that'll be first. And yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. Nice.
A couple of things that I'd like to ask, and I think there's one. The first part, I understand what it means to think about the risk of activity, but what about the risk of
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So when you have like, yeah, we have risks of technologies and activities, but when you're looking at a block of text, are you thinking about like the riskiness of the content, or are you thinking about the riskiness as in the perceived riskiness by the reader? That's one question. Is that what you were getting at, or were you getting at something slightly different?
Yeah, I just wasn't sure what you meant. Like,
yeah.
If somebody asked me to rate the risk of a tweet, I don't know what the question is really asking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's even a problem when you get down to individual words. So like if I were to ask you like rate the riskiness of Australia, you'd be like visiting Australia, like, or is it like geopolitically you're talking about? In the case of a block of text, it's the same problem, but probably worse. And so I don't have a straight answer to that. I think that like, if you imagine the situation where perhaps you were like trying to predict, let's say the number of the searches for pet insurance from like news articles on insurance or something, what would you be predicting there? I guess like the perception of the people writing the news articles around pet insurance, and the perceptions of the people that read it around pet insurance. But yeah, there'll be like a lot of messiness as well getting in the way.
Like Paul had a question. Paul, you just don't want to ask something?
No, I was just thanking you. It was a really good talk.
Thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you for that. Sorry, one of the things I was a little, I think I missed something in the second project because I'm a little confused as to kind of what you're trying to do exactly, because it sounded like from the beginning you're trying to train LSA on free association. But then when you talk about the roads and love approach, you're talking about similarity ratings and things like that. So it was just, I guess when you started talking about things that you would optimize, what exactly would you be, what exactly would you be optimizing there when you're applying LSA to free association?
So in the case of LSA, I guess you're just trying to, well, with free association data, you're trying to explain as much of the variance as you can in terms of the transformed raw counts in the free association data. So the number of times each word appears next to each other word, using these principal components. So it's not specifically designed with taking into account, for instance, the fact that there is a particular way that people are going from a queue to a response. And while we don't know everything about that, we might know some things, or we can constrain that in order to improve on LSA. I think it turns out that if you were to fit like train Word2Vec on free associations, you would actually be doing, when you train Word2Vec, I think someone's shown that you're actually doing something very similar to LSA. You're implicitly factorizing the same PPMI transformed matrix. And so if you were to do Word2Vec on free association, you're already not doing something so different from this. There's a lot of similarities between all of these approaches, because if you're doing Word2Vec on free association, sorry if this is like just confusing you even more, but it's already, even though it wasn't designed to take into account that process from queue to response, Word2Vec is already doing some kind of similarity between queue representation and response representation, which is the dot product. And then in the softmax version, you're basically doing Lucis ratio of strengths. So that would be like the first way to start off with this project, is just try Word2Vec basically. But yeah, it's just like maybe thinking a bit more about that relationship between cue and response to try and obtain better representations.
I thought that was really interesting. I'd love to chat more about the historical speak you were showing. I have one question about that, which I think is not. Is that good? Yeah, I had one question about the historical stuff, which I think is kind of covered by Charles's question earlier. So maybe I've got a more naive one, which was the problem you were describing with project one, where you had potentially or close to as many dimensions as things you're predicting. I wasn't familiar with regularized regression, so thank you for your description of that, but it sounded like it was just penalizing additional dimensions, right? Could you get anything out of just increasing the penalty term rather than increasing the number of things? Did you try that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that we're doing the regularization is that penalty term is flexible. And so you'll fit that penalty term also using cross-validation, but ensuring that you're not giving that access to the validation data ultimately. So it's like a nested approach. But the idea is, yeah, that penalty term you fit in order to maximize the performance. But as you get more training points, that penalty term the best penalty term might get smaller.
Right, that makes a lot of sense, thanks. And I guess the other thing, which maybe is retreading ground that Charles already covered, but with the, when you're talking about the politicians' speeches during risky times, like say Battle of Britain or what have you, I would think that when it comes to measuring risk, I would think that a politician giving a speech during a risky time would want to use reassuring words.
Mm-hmm.
And so the thing that they're talking about might be risky, but the speech itself may not be. But I guess that, it just comes down to what you're measuring, and yeah, not really a question, just a half-formed thought I had.
No, I think that's like a really fundamental point actually, because in a way, what we've been doing so far is we've been using what are called static embeddings. So you just look at each word in isolation. But if someone were to try and be reassuring and saying something like, it's when the war is not that dangerous or whatever, we're close to the end of the war, a contextualized embedding might be able to take that into account a bit more, where the words preceding or preceding war would actually be taken into account in the representation.
Yeah, thanks for the very interesting talk. I think the topic of risk in these times is very relevant, so it's nice to see this applied to semantic analysis. I just had a question about the psychometric model. What were the types of underlying dimensions that were asked to people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there were 9 of them. It was how much threat does this evoke? How well known is this risk source? How well known is it to science? How delayed are the negative impacts of this? So are they immediate or delayed? Everything's on a scale of 1 to 7. Yeah. And how fatal is it? Does it affect lots of people, or is it like just affecting the one person?
Okay, because I guess some of these dimensions you could also input as something to estimate directly, right? So you could kind of try to approximate your psychometric model based on at least some of them. I think some would be more tricky to combine, but if you have that analysis where you combine the psychometric model with the text-based models, you could think of kind of extracting some of the dimensions and then estimating directly those psychometric dimensions and adding those in and see if that kind of helps. Yeah, and that might give you a bit more additional insight. And I guess a follow-up question on that, the question of insight, that also relates to some of the other questions here. So you have 300 risk terms, right? And they cover all kinds of things from chess to dogs to nuclear disasters. So it seems that for some of these terms, it would be fairly unambiguous to think about risk, say nuclear disasters. Whereas for other things like dog, there might be a lot of variation. Have you looked at the prediction quality for certain domains within those sets of concepts. So do people generally agree more about the riskiness of certain types of concepts versus others?
Yeah, I don't know if we haven't looked quite at that. No, I mean, we did something similar at one point, but I think that would be like a really cool thing to look at. And we've been thinking about that a bit as well when collecting this new set of risk sources, because we've been trying to expand that list, and choosing what to include was quite a process. It involved like a couple of people, even some algorithms, I think like maybe we're going to try and, in addition to doing what you just said, which is going to be really helpful, just like looking at, for instance, the reliability of various risk ratings and things like that for different sources. Maybe even using something like mouse tracking when collecting this data to estimate people's confidence in their choices.
There's still a couple of more minutes, so if it's okay, I would like to ask one more question. I know that Dirk's also quite interested in individual differences, so kind of the obvious thing that comes to mind here is different people might have different judgments of risks. Is that something that you think about as part of your PhD, or and is this something that certain types of models might be very suited for, to kind of give insights there?
Yeah, unfortunately, other than going, oh, this is a shame that we're not looking at individual differences, or that it's hard to do that, I haven't thought about it too much. I guess like one issue is just, and this is something that a colleague of mine, Samuel, has been working on, like trying to obtain individual representations, like vector representations would be just really hard. But yeah, I'm sure that there would be ways as well to like look at individual differences, and if you have any ideas, I'd be really keen to hear.
If I understood right, in the first study, you were trying to predict these risk ratings from the latent dimensions. Is that right? Yeah. So there's a problem, isn't there, in the kind of literature on these models where these dimensions are like hard to interpret. So when you use these dimensions to predict the risk ratings, like, do you need to know what these dimensions represent? Yeah, it's
a really interesting problem. It's one that we probably spent like a couple of months going down as a bit of a rabbit hole, because I think when we started this project, there was a bit of a dilemma of how much do we want to focus on prediction versus explanation. And we were really trying to look at, for instance, whether we can see whether there's any variance that isn't being explained by the psychometric model that is being explained by the semantic models, and then predicting those residuals and trying to then investigate what the important dimensions are doing. We even tried a framework, which I think is called the polar framework, where you can project your latent uninterpretable dimensions into an interpretable space. But it was just very hard. There was a lot of noise in that analysis. The dimensions which ended up being predictive, when you tried to validate it, the correct kinds of dimensions ended up like maybe the 10th most important, but there's still like 9 others that just didn't make any sense. So I don't think it was a perfect approach, but if someone can do that, that would be really cool. I'd love to learn how. Yeah.
Probably the last one, but James was wondering, have you or will you make these SWOW embeddings available to other researchers online?
Yeah, I think, so I mean, the SWO ones, we haven't yet, but I think we will. Yeah, all of the sort of data will be available. Yeah.
Thanks for coming, everyone. We don't have any more seminars this semester, but we'll keep you guys in the loop when we start planning them for the second semester.
Thank you.